October 15th, 1817. The morning air carried the crispness of autumn as Clara Thornhill approached the grand facade of Pembroke House, her worn leather satchel clutched against the folds of her grey woolen dress. The edifice rose before her like a monument to all she was not, its pale stone glowing golden in the slanted light of 9 o'clock, its windows gleaming with a prosperity she could scarcely imagine. She had made this walk each morning for 8 months now, entering through the side door as befitted her station, nodding to the servants who regarded her with that particular blend of courtesy and condescension reserved for those who occupied the uncertain territory between staff and gentry. Today, as she surrendered her modest cloak to a footman whose livery likely cost more than her entire wardrobe, she overheard the whispered exchange between 2 housemaids arranging flowers in the entrance hall. Nearly 30 and still unmarried. Such a shame, though what can one expect with no portion and no particular beauty to recommend her? The words landed with familiar weight upon her shoulders, but Clara had long since learned to carry such burdens with grace. She proceeded through the corridor toward the music room, her steps silent on the thick carpets, passing portraits of Pembroke ancestors who gazed down with aristocratic indifference. The music room itself was her sanctuary, a high-ceilinged chamber with tall windows facing the gardens where autumn roses still bloomed in defiant splendor. The pianoforte, a magnificent instrument of rosewood and ivory, stood in a pool of morning light that transformed it into something almost sacred. Lady Sophia and Lady Caroline were already waiting, their young faces bright with genuine affection that Clara treasured as the one authentic warmth in her otherwise circumscribed existence. "Good morning, Miss Thornhill," Sophia called out, her 16 years evident in the enthusiasm she had not yet learned to temper. Caroline, at 14, was already more reserved, but her smile was no less welcoming. Clara settled herself at the piano bench, her fingers finding their familiar positions, and began the lesson with scales and exercises before progressing to the Clementi sonatinas the girls were learning. As she demonstrated a particularly difficult passage, her hands moving across the keys with fluid precision, she felt the transformation that always overtook her when music filled the space between intention and execution. Here, in these moments, she was not poor Clara Thornhill, the impoverished gentlewoman whose father had drunk away what little inheritance there was before dying and leaving her alone at 20, with nothing but his musical training and a few pieces of sheet music. Here she was, simply in the only language that had never betrayed her. The girls attempted the passage with varying success, and Clara guided them with patience born of genuine love for her art. She did not see the tall figure of the Duke of Pembroke pass by the open doorway, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, his expression distant as always. He did not pause, did not glance inside, gave no indication he knew or cared that she existed. This, too, was familiar. Clara had accepted long ago that invisibility was simply the condition of her life. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The lesson continued into the late morning, the clock on the mantelpiece marking the approach of 11, and Sophia bent over the keyboard with fierce concentration as she attempted the Beethoven sonata that had bedeviled her for the past fortnight. Her fingers stumbled over the same passage for the 3rd time, and Clara heard the frustration building in the tempo of her breathing. "Let me show you once more," Clara said gently, and Sophia moved aside with visible relief. Clara positioned her hands over the keys, found the beginning of the troublesome phrase, and began to play. Within the span of 3 measures, the transformation overtook her as it always did, that strange dissolution of self into sound, and she forgot she was demonstrating a lesson, forgot the modest parlor instructor she was meant to be, and simply played. The music rose through the high-ceilinged room like something alive, the notes cascading and interweaving with a precision and passion that transcended mere technical proficiency. When she finished, silence held for a heartbeat before Caroline spoke with wondering admiration. "Miss Thornhill, why do you not perform publicly? You play more beautifully than any of the ladies we have heard in London." Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the old shame of thwarted dreams. "My position does not permit such things, Lady Caroline," she replied with careful neutrality. "And I am content to share music in this more intimate setting." The sisters exchanged glances that suggested they understood more than she wished, but they were kind enough not to press further. The lesson concluded shortly thereafter, and as Clara gathered her music and prepared to depart, she reached into her reticule for her gloves and felt the crinkle of paper. The letter had arrived that morning, delivered to her lodgings before she departed for Pembroke House, and she had thrust it into her bag without opening it because she knew what it contained. Now, standing in the entrance hall as a footman retrieved her cloak, she withdrew the envelope and broke the seal with trembling fingers. The words confirmed her fears in her landlord's cramped script. 2 months' rent overdue, payment demanded within the week, eviction proceedings to follow if the debt remained unsettled. Clara calculated rapidly in her mind, the arithmetic of desperation that had become grimly familiar. Her wages, modest as they were, barely covered her rent and the simplest food. She had sold what little jewelry her mother had left her, had mended her dresses until the fabric could scarcely bear another stitch. There was nothing left to sacrifice, no margin remaining between survival and catastrophe. She folded the letter with hands that she willed to steadiness, and replaced it in her reticule just as the footman returned with her cloak. As she fastened it around her shoulders, she heard the rustle of silk and the high, carrying voice that she had learned to dread. Lady Beatrice Somerset swept into the entrance hall with the assumption of ownership that came naturally to women of her standing, her fashionable pelisse of deep burgundy making Clara feel even more drab by comparison. "Miss Thornhill," Lady Beatrice said, her gaze sliding over Clara with dismissive assessment before moving past her entirely as though she were a piece of furniture of no particular interest. Clara murmured a greeting that went unacknowledged as Lady Beatrice proceeded toward the stairs, calling out for Sophia and Caroline with the easy intimacy of a family friend. Clara stepped out into the October morning, the door closing behind her with quiet finality, and walked back toward her lodgings, with the weight of the letter pressing against her ribs like a stone. October 22nd, 1817. The morning arrived with the same ritual precision as the 6 mornings before it, Clara ascending the steps of Pembroke House at 9 o'clock precisely, her grey dress now showing a careful mend at the left sleeve, where the fabric had finally surrendered to time and wear. She had sat up late the previous evening with her needle and the last decent thread she possessed, her fingers working by candlelight she could ill afford, determined that her poverty should not manifest as slovenliness, even if the repair was visible to anyone who cared to look closely. The music room welcomed her as always, the pianoforte gleaming in the autumn light that fell through windows now framing gardens gone more golden and russet, as October deepened into itself. Sophia and Caroline were already practicing scales, their young fingers stumbling over the exercises with the distracted quality of minds not yet fully awakened, and Clara took her place beside them with the gentle corrections and encouragements that had become as natural as breathing. In his study adjacent to the music room, separated only by a heavy oak door that stood slightly ajar, Alexander Pembroke sat at his desk, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence that detailed the complex economics of land and tenant and harvest, the numbers before him telling a story of responsibilities that weighed upon him with relentless constancy. He had been reviewing the accounts since early morning, attempting to reconcile expenses that seemed to multiply beyond reason, when he became aware of music filtering through the open door. Not the halting exercises of his sisters, but something else entirely. A Mozart sonata played with such clarity and feeling that his pen stilled mid-calculation. He found himself listening rather than working, the music reaching some place in him that had been shuttered since Catherine's death 2 years prior, and before he quite realized what he was doing, he had risen from his chair and moved toward the doorway. He stood at the threshold unobserved, his tall frame just beyond the angle of vision from the piano, and watched as Clara demonstrated a passage for Sophia, her hands moving across the keys with fluid precision, while her face underwent a transformation that struck him with unexpected force. The pleasant neutrality she wore like armor had dissolved entirely, replaced by an expression of such passion and intelligence and a live feeling that he found himself staring as though seeing her for the first time. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted, her entire being focused with an intensity that spoke of devotion to something beyond the mere mechanical reproduction of notes on a page. When she finished and opened her eyes, returning her attention to Sophia with patient instruction, the mask of pleasant composure settled back over her features so completely that Alexander wondered if he had imagined what he had just witnessed. He retreated to his study before she could discover his observation, but he found he could not return his attention to the account books. The columns of figures now seeming impossibly trivial compared to the mystery of Clara Thornhill and the passion she kept so carefully hidden. In the music room, Clara concluded the lesson and gathered her belongings, reaching into her reticule for her gloves and finding there the second letter her landlord had sent, this one more urgent than the first, demanding payment within 3 days and threatening immediate eviction proceedings should she fail to comply. October 29th, 1817. The morning arrived sullen with rain, heavy clouds pressing low over London and releasing a cold drizzle that found its way through even the most carefully maintained cloaks, and Clara arrived at Pembroke House at 9:30, with her inadequate wrap soaked through and clinging to her shoulders with clammy insistence. She had left her lodgings earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the worst of the weather, but the rain had intensified during her walk, and now she stood in the entrance hall, feeling the water drip from the hem of her dress onto the marble floor, while a footman took her cloak with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality that nonetheless conveyed his awareness of her bedraggled state. She was attempting to blot the moisture from her face with a handkerchief that was itself damp when she heard boots on the stairs and looked up to see the Duke descending, still in riding clothes with his dark hair tousled from the wind and his coat showing evidence of his own encounter with the rain. Alexander had been out since dawn inspecting drainage issues on the estate, and he had returned cold and irritated, only to find himself stopping mid-stride at the sight of Clara standing in his entrance hall, looking like a half-drowned sparrow, her grey dress darkened with water and her face pale with cold. "Miss Thornhill?" he said, his voice carrying a note of concern that surprised them both. "You are thoroughly soaked." She curtsied hastily, discomfited by his direct attention. "Your Grace, I apologize for my appearance. I will proceed directly to the music room." He frowned slightly, noting the way she was shivering despite her attempts to conceal it. "You will do nothing of the sort until you have warmed yourself. Please come to the morning room. There is a fire laid." She hesitated, her pride warring with her discomfort. "I would not wish to presume upon your household, Your Grace. It is no presumption," he replied, and the gentleness in his tone made something catch in her chest. "It is simple consideration. Please." She followed him to the morning room, acutely aware of the impropriety of being alone with him, even as a housemaid appeared to serve as inadvertent chaperone, and stood before the fire while he instructed the maid to bring tea. They waited in silence that felt less awkward than it should have, and Clara found herself studying him from beneath her lashes, noting the way the firelight caught the sharp planes of his face and the unexpected kindness in his grey eyes. "Your cloak is insufficient for this weather," he observed quietly. She felt the familiar flush of shame at having her poverty exposed. "It serves well enough, Your Grace." He looked as though he might say more, but refrained, and instead asked if she had far to walk each morning. She told him the distance, and he listened with an attention that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced in years. The tea arrived, and she drank it gratefully, feeling warmth seep back into her limbs. And when she finally made her way to the music room, she found herself thinking not of the lesson ahead, but of the expression in his eyes when he had looked at her, as though she were a person worthy of concern rather than a servant to be overlooked. During the lesson that followed, Alexander found himself once again drawn to his study door to listen, and when Sophia mentioned in passing that her brother seemed less melancholy of late, Clara smiled politely and attributed it to the approach of better weather, never imagining that she herself might be the cause. November 5th, 1817. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the music room with the particular golden melancholy of late autumn, and Clara gathered her belongings at the conclusion of the day's lesson, fastening her cloak with fingers that trembled slightly from fatigue and strain that had nothing to do with the hour spent teaching scales and sonatas. Sophia had remarked twice during the lesson that she looked pale, and Caroline had watched her with an expression of concern that Clara found simultaneously touching and mortifying, for she prided herself on maintaining a facade of composure regardless of the turmoil that churned beneath it. She bid the sisters farewell with her customary warmth and descended the front steps of Pembroke House into the crisp November air, turning her steps toward lodgings she might not occupy much longer. While behind her in the music room, Sophia turned to Caroline with troubled eyes and said that Miss Thornhill seemed truly unwell. In the library where Alexander had retreated after an afternoon of tedious correspondence with his man of business, he found himself thinking of the piano instructor with a frequency that surprised him. And when his sisters entered some 20 minutes after the lesson's conclusion, he looked up from the book he was not actually reading and asked with studied casualness whether Miss Thornhill had seemed herself today. The question opened a floodgate of information as Sophia settled onto the sofa and declared that their dear Miss Thornhill was clearly suffering some distress, for she had dark circles beneath her eyes and her dress hung more loosely than it had a month prior, and Caroline added with the earnest detail of youth that she had seen Miss Thornhill counting coins from her reticule during a brief moment when she thought herself unobserved, her expression one of such worry that Caroline had nearly asked if she might help. Alexander listened with growing concern as his sisters painted a portrait of deprivation he had been too preoccupied to notice, and when they departed, he summoned Mrs. Langley and inquired with more directness than tact about the wages paid to the music instructor. The housekeeper, a woman of 50 years with the practical wisdom of long service, informed him that Miss Thornhill received £30 per annum, an arrangement made by his late Duchess and never revised, barely sufficient for modest lodgings and food with nothing remaining for contingencies or comfort. Alexander felt an unexpected surge of anger at himself for his neglect, and at the circumstances that left a woman of evident talent and education in such precarious straits, and he dismissed Mrs. Langley with instructions he would clarify shortly, his mind already forming a plan that would allow him to assist without wounding the pride he had observed in Clara's careful dignity. Across London in lodgings that consisted of a single room in a boarding house long past its better days, Clara opened her door to find a notice fixed to the frame, official and uncompromising in its language, informing her that she had 14 days to remit payment in full or vacate the premises, and she sank onto her narrow bed with the paper clutched in hands that had finally begun to shake in earnest. November 8th, 1817. The afternoon had faded into early evening by the time Clara completed her lesson and gathered her belongings. The music room bathed in the dusky blue light that preceded full darkness, and she was fastening the clasps of her worn leather satchel when a housemaid appeared at the door with a message that Mrs. Langley wished to speak with her before she departed, a summons that sent an immediate flutter of anxiety through Clara's chest, because such requests were unusual, and she could not imagine what matter required the housekeeper's attention. She followed the maid through the corridors of Pemberton House to the housekeeper's room, a comfortable chamber near the kitchens that smelled of lavender and beeswax, and found Mrs. Langley seated at her desk with an expression that Clara could not quite decipher, something between sympathy and satisfaction. "Miss Thornhill," the housekeeper began without preamble, "His Grace has recently undertaken a review of household accounts and wages, and he has discovered that your compensation has not been adjusted since it was first established by the late Duchess some 3 years past." Clara felt her throat tighten, uncertain where this conversation might lead, and she remained standing with her hands clasped before her in an attitude of respectful attention. Mrs. Langley continued, her tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "His Grace has determined that the wages you receive are inequitably low given the nature and quality of your service to this household, and he has instructed me to inform you that your annual compensation will be increased to £65, effective immediately, with the difference for the past 6 months provided to you today as rectification of the oversight." The words seemed to echo strangely in Clara's ears, and for a moment she could not quite comprehend their meaning, could not reconcile the sum mentioned with the desperate calculations she had been performing each night as she attempted to determine how she might survive the coming weeks. Mrs. Langley opened a drawer and withdrew a small leather purse, which she placed upon the desk between them with a soft clink of coins. "This contains £17 and 10 shillings, representing the additional wages owed to you for the period since April, as well as your regular monthly payment." Clara stared at the purse as though it might vanish if she reached for it, and when she finally spoke, her voice emerged rough with suppressed emotion. "This is charity," she said quietly, "and I cannot accept charity." Mrs. Langley's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "It is not charity, Miss Thornhill. It is correction of an injustice." His Grace was quite clear on this point. "You have been underpaid for work of considerable value, and that error is now remedied." Clara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and fought them back with fierce determination, unwilling to display such weakness even before this kind woman who had always treated her with courtesy. She thought of the eviction notice folded in her reticule, of the landlord who would receive his payment tomorrow, of the reprieve she had not dared to hope for, and she reached out with trembling fingers to take the purse, its weight both literal and symbolic in her palm. "Thank you," she whispered, and then, more steadily, "Please convey my deepest gratitude to His Grace." Mrs. Langley nodded, and Clara understood from her expression that the housekeeper knew more of her circumstances than she had revealed, that perhaps this entire household had observed her struggle with more compassion than she had imagined. She left Pemberton House as the lamps were being lit along the street, walking through the November darkness toward lodgings she would now be able to keep, and she did not see Alexander standing at the window of his study watching her departure with an expression of quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had acted correctly, even as he acknowledged to himself that his concern for Clara Thornhill had begun to extend well beyond that of an employer for his employee. November 12th, 1817. Clara arrived at Pembroke House a quarter hour before the customary time, her heart beating with uncomfortable force against her ribs as she informed the footman that she wished to speak briefly with His Grace before commencing the morning lesson, a request that seemed to hang in the air between them with more weight than such simple words should carry. She was shown to the library rather than the music room, and found Alexander standing near the windows, with the morning light illuminating his profile. And when he turned at her entrance, his expression shifted from surprise to something she could not quite name, but that made her breath catch nevertheless. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I wished to thank you personally for the correction to my wages, and to assure you that I am deeply sensible of the fairness you have shown in reviewing the household accounts." She had rehearsed these words during the sleepless hours of the previous nights, determined to maintain her dignity, to treat the matter as the business transaction Mrs. Langley had described rather than the charity Clara still half suspected it to be. Alexander moved toward her, with that particular grace she had observed in him, the unconscious elegance of a man born to authority, but tempered by something gentler, and he gestured for her to sit, though she remained standing, feeling that to sit would somehow make her more vulnerable than she could bear. "Miss Thornhill," he said, and his voice carried a warmth that seemed to wrap around her name like an embrace. The adjustment was long overdue, and nothing more than justice required. But I am glad if it has provided you some relief. Their eyes met and held for a moment that stretched beyond its natural duration, and Clara felt something shift in the space between them, some acknowledgement that this conversation was about more than wages and household management. He asked then, with what seemed genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness, whether she had received formal training at a conservatory, and she explained that her father had been her only teacher, a musician of considerable talent, but limited prospects, who had poured all his knowledge and passion into his only child before consumption had taken him when she was 19. Alexander listened with an attention so complete that she found herself saying more than she had intended, describing her father's joy in music and his insistence that she would one day compose works that would outlive them both, a prophecy that had died with him as she was forced into the practical necessity of teaching rather than creating. "Your talent far exceeds what would be expected for an instructor," Alexander observed, and there was no condescension in his tone, only a recognition that made her flush with pleasure and discomfort in equal measure. She deflected with practiced ease, saying that she was fortunate to have employment that allowed her to remain connected to music at all, but he pressed forward with a question that seemed to surprise them both. "Do you still compose, Miss Thornhill?" The words hung between them, weighted with significance, and she found herself admitting that she had not written anything in years, that the demands of survival had left little room for such luxuries, though she did not say that she had also lacked the hope that had once fueled her creativity. Before he could respond, the door opened, and Sophia and Caroline swept in with apologies for their lateness, and the moment fractured into the ordinary business of lessons and propriety. But as Clara moved toward the music room, she felt Alexander's gaze following her, and knew that something between them had fundamentally changed. November 19th, 1817. Clara arrived at precisely 9 in the morning, as had become her custom, the crisp autumn air having given way to the first hints of approaching winter, and she was arranging the sheet music for the day's lesson when the door to the music room opened and Alexander entered with an expression that suggested his arrival was not accidental, but rather carefully timed, though he maintained the pretense of casual purpose as he greeted her with a politeness that had lately acquired an undertone of something warmer. "Miss Thornhill," he said, nodding as she rose and curtsied with the automatic grace that years of navigating the precarious space between gentility and service had instilled in her. "I hope I am not interrupting, but I wished to discuss arrangements for Sophia's debut ball, which, as you know, will take place in 2 months' time, and music will naturally be a significant component of the evening." Clara resumed her seat at the piano bench as Sophia and Caroline entered, and the sisters immediately protested when she began to rise again, insisting she remain comfortable, and there was something in their eagerness that suggested they had been anticipating this conversation with an enthusiasm that made Clara vaguely uneasy. The discussion began practically enough, with Alexander inquiring about appropriate selections for a ball of this nature, and Clara offered suggestions with the professional competence she had cultivated, mentioning particular pieces that would suit the dancing and the dignity of the occasion. But then Sophia leaned forward with barely contained excitement and said that surely Miss Thornhill could help them prepare more extensively, perhaps even performing for some of the smaller gatherings that would precede the ball itself. Clara felt her breath catch because such a suggestion elevated her status in a way that seemed both wonderful and dangerous, and she glanced at Alexander to gauge his reaction to his sister's impropriety. Caroline added with the guileless honesty of her 14 years that it would be lovely to have Miss Thornhill play at the ball itself, but of course Lady Beatrice Somerset and the other patronesses would never permit a paid instructor to perform at such an event, which everyone knew, even if no one said it quite so boldly. Clara saw something flicker across Alexander's face, a tightening at the corners of his mouth that suggested displeasure, and he was silent for a moment before speaking in a tone that carried quiet authority. "I think," he said slowly, as though the idea were forming as he spoke, though Clara suspected he had considered it beforehand, that we might hold several intimate musical evenings here at Pembroke House during the coming weeks, gatherings where Miss Thornhill would both perform and provide instruction to you both, allowing you to learn through observation as well as practice, and such evenings would serve the dual purpose of preparing you for your debut, while providing entertainment for a small circle of family and close friends. The proposal hung in the air with a weight that seemed disproportionate to its apparent simplicity, and Clara understood that what he offered was not merely an expansion of her duties, but a subtle elevation of her position, a blurring of the sharp line between servant and guest that society drew with such rigid precision. She felt torn between gratitude and apprehension, aware that such visibility could expose her to criticism and judgment. But when she met Alexander's gaze, she saw in his eyes an expression of such warm encouragement that she found herself agreeing with a voice that trembled only slightly, saying that she would be honored to assist in whatever manner His Grace deemed appropriate. And the smile that crossed his face made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with professional satisfaction, and everything to do with the dangerous hope that had begun growing in her heart despite all her attempts to contain it. November 26th, 1817. Clara arrived at Pembroke House as the winter evening was settling over the grounds, the sun already vanished behind the bare trees and the windows glowing with warm candlelight that seemed to promise something beyond the ordinary boundaries of her employment, and she carried with her the worn leather case that held her most precious sheet music, selections she had deliberated over during sleepless hours the previous night, with an anxiety that felt both foolish and entirely justified. Mrs. Langley met her at the servants' entrance as usual, but guided her not to the familiar music room, but rather to the drawing room, a space Clara had glimpsed only in passing and never entered, and the difference seemed to carry symbolic weight that made her pulse quicken with nervousness and something dangerously close to hope. She had worn her best dress, a simple gown of deep blue that had once belonged to her mother, and which she had altered to fit her own smaller frame. And though it was modest by the standards of society, it was becoming in a way her usual grey teaching dress was not, the colour bringing warmth to her pale complexion and making her feel less invisible than she had grown accustomed to feeling. The drawing room was intimate rather than grand, arranged with chairs and a settee positioned near the pianoforte in a semicircle that suggested conversation as much as performance, and candles burned in silver holders that reflected their light against cream-coloured walls, while a fire blazed in the hearth with a welcoming warmth that stood in contrast to the December cold beyond the windows. Alexander rose as she entered, and his sisters looked up with bright, eager faces, and Clara saw that the gathering was precisely as he had promised. Small and private, with only the four of them, plus Mrs. Langley, who settled into a chair near the door with her needlework, a chaperone whose presence preserved propriety while remaining unobtrusive. Clara took her place at the pianoforte after greeting them with a curtsy that felt awkward given the strange hybrid nature of her role tonight, neither quite servant nor quite guest, and she arranged her music with hands that trembled slightly before beginning with a Beethoven sonata she knew would demonstrate both technical skill and emotional depth, the Pathétique, with its dramatic contrasts and passionate intensity. As she played, she felt the familiar transformation that music always wrought in her, the dissolution of self-consciousness into pure expression, and when she glanced up briefly, she found Alexander watching her with an attention so complete and unguarded that it made her falter for half a beat before recovering. The piece concluded, and for a moment there was only silence, the kind of charged stillness that follows profound experience. And then Alexander spoke with a warmth in his voice that seemed to wrap around her like an embrace, saying that he had heard many accomplished pianists in London, drawing rooms and concert halls, but none who brought such feeling to the music, such clear understanding of what the composer had intended to convey. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks at praise offered with such evident sincerity, and she realized that this was what she had been starving for without knowing it, not mere acknowledgement of technical competence, but recognition of the soul she poured into her playing, validation of the part of herself she valued most, and which the world had taught her had no practical worth. He asked then, with a gentleness that suggested he understood he was requesting something personal, whether she might play something of her own composition, and she hesitated because her own works felt like exposing pieces of her heart to examination. Vulnerable in a way that performing another's music was not. But something in his expression, an openness that matched what he was asking of her, gave her courage, and she began to play a piece she had written in the awful months following her father's death, a melancholy meditation on loss and memory that she had never performed for anyone, and had not played herself in years. The notes seemed to fill the room with an aching beauty, and when she finished and lifted her hands from the keys, she found tears on her own cheeks and saw answering emotion in Alexander's face, and their eyes met with an understanding that transcended words and social position and all the barriers that the world had constructed between them. And in that moment, Clara knew with terrifying certainty that something irrevocable had begun. December 3rd, 1817. Clara sat in her small rented room as the clock on the mantel approached 11 in the evening, the fire having burned low so that shadows gathered in the corners, and the chill of December crept through the worn curtains that hung at the single window overlooking the narrow street below. And though exhaustion weighted her limbs after the long day of teaching, she found sleep impossible because her mind returned again and again to the musical evening 1 week prior, replaying every moment with the obsessive attention one gives to experiences that feel both precious and dangerous. She sat in the chair by the window, wrapped in her shawl, and allowed herself the luxury of remembering how Alexander had looked at her when she played her father's composition, the expression on his face suggesting he had truly heard what she was trying to say through the music, understood the grief and beauty and longing she had poured into those notes, and the warmth in his eyes when he praised her had made her feel visible in a way she had not felt since her father's death had left her alone in the world. It was foolish to read too much into such moments, she told herself sternly. He was a duke, and she was nobody, a paid instructor whose modest wages he had recently corrected out of simple fairness, and whatever kindness he showed her was likely nothing more than the natural courtesy of a gentleman toward someone in his employ who had demonstrated competence. Yet even as she recited these sensible cautions, she could not entirely suppress the dangerous warmth that bloomed in her chest when she thought of him, could not forget the way their eyes had met after she finished playing, the understanding that had passed between them feeling like something beyond the ordinary boundaries of employer and employee, teacher and patron. She pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window and watched her breath fog the pane, wondering what he was doing at this moment, whether he thought of her at all, or if she was merely another household concern that crossed his mind occasionally before being displaced by matters of real importance. Meanwhile, in his study at Pembroke House, Alexander sat alone at his desk, with correspondence spread before him that he had been attempting to address for the past hour, without making any meaningful progress because his thoughts kept drifting to Clara Thornhill, to the way her face transformed when she played music, to the intelligence and sensitivity evident in every word she spoke during their brief conversations. He rose and paced to the window, looking out over the dark grounds, then turned and found himself facing the portrait of his late wife that hung above the mantel. Catherine's serene, painted face, regarding him with the gentle expression he remembered from their 8 years of marriage. A comfortable, affectionate union that had been cut short by fever 2 years ago, leaving him hollowed with grief and alone, except for his responsibility to his sisters. He had believed that chapter of his life permanently closed, that whatever capacity he had for such feelings had been buried with Catherine. But in recent weeks he had felt something stirring in himself that he had thought dead, an awareness of possibility, an appetite for life that had been absent since her death, and he knew with absolute certainty that Clara was the cause of this reawakening. He examined the portrait as though seeking permission, or perhaps simply acknowledging what had changed, and he realized that what he felt for Clara was different from what he had felt for Catherine. Not a replacement, but something entirely new. A connection forged through music and conversation and the recognition of kindred loneliness. Society would condemn such an attachment to a penniless instructor of no family or fortune. He knew this. Lady Beatrice Somerset and her circle would make Clara's life miserable if they suspected. But as he stood in the quiet study with only the ticking clock and crackling fire for company, he discovered that he did not care what society thought. And with that realization came decision, clear and irrevocable, that he would pursue this connection wherever it might lead. And he began to formulate how he might do so in a way that would not compromise her dignity or expose her to cruelty before he was in a position to protect her fully. December 10th, 1817. The morning lesson proceeded as usual, with Sophia working through a Mozart sonata, while Caroline practiced scales at the smaller pianoforte that had been moved into the music room for their joint instruction, and Clara offered corrections and encouragement with the professional composure she had cultivated over years of teaching, though beneath that calm surface her thoughts kept returning to the previous week's reflections and the dangerous hope she had tried so firmly to suppress. When the clock struck 9:30 and the lesson concluded, the sisters departed for their daily walk with their governess, and Clara began gathering her sheet music in preparation for her own departure, when a knock at the music-room door made her look up to find Alexander entering with Mrs. Langley following at a respectful distance, the housekeeper's presence signaling that whatever was to transpire would be properly chaperoned. Clara stood immediately and curtsied, confused by this interruption to the usual routine, and Alexander inclined his head in acknowledgement before speaking in a tone that seemed carefully neutral, as though he had rehearsed what he intended to say. He began by thanking her for the musical evening, and noting that his sisters had benefited greatly from her instruction, then paused as though gathering resolve, before continuing with a request that struck Clara as so unexpected she wondered if she had misheard him. He explained that he had long suffered from difficulty sleeping, a condition that had worsened since his wife's death, and that he had discovered during the recent evening performance that music, particularly the kind of music Clara played with such feeling, brought him a peace he had not experienced in years. He wondered, and here his formality seemed to intensify, as though to counterbalance the irregularity of what he was proposing, whether she might be willing to play for him in the evenings when the household had retired, perhaps at midnight when his insomnia was most acute, and he hastened to add that Mrs. Langley would of course be present to maintain propriety, and that he would naturally compensate her additionally for these extra hours beyond her normal teaching duties. Clara stared at him in stunned silence, her mind racing to comprehend what he was truly asking, because the request was highly irregular by any standard, suggesting an intimacy that transcended the usual boundaries of employer and instructor. Yet his manner remained scrupulously respectful, and she realized that he was asking rather than commanding, granting her the dignity of choice when he could simply have ordered her attendance as a condition of her employment. She found her voice after a moment that stretched too long and said that she would be honored to be of service if her playing brought him comfort. The words formal and careful, though her heart was beating rapidly with a mixture of apprehension and something that felt dangerously like excitement. He looked relieved, and something more, a warmth entering his expression that made her forget briefly that Mrs. Langley stood witnessing this exchange, and he asked if she might be willing to begin this very evening, explaining that he would send his carriage for her at 11:30 to bring her to Pembroke House. Clara agreed, her voice steadier now despite the confusion of emotions churning within her, and after a few more details were settled regarding which entrance she should use and where Mrs. Langley would meet her, Alexander thanked her with a sincerity that seemed to convey more than gratitude for a service arrangement, and then he withdrew, leaving Clara alone with the housekeeper, who regarded her with an expression that might have been sympathy, or perhaps merely professional neutrality. As Clara gathered her belongings and made her way out into the December morning, the cold air sharp against her face, she felt as though she had agreed to something far more significant than playing piano at an unconventional hour, though she could not have articulated precisely what that something might be, and she spent the remainder of the day in her lodgings alternating between practicing the pieces she might perform and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in agreeing to an arrangement that seemed to blur every careful boundary she had maintained since entering the Duke's service. December 10th, 1817, midnight. The carriage arrived at Clara's lodgings at 11:30 as promised, and carried her through the sleeping streets to Pemberton House, where she entered through the side door as instructed to find Mrs. Langley waiting in the dimly lit corridor, and together they proceeded through the quiet house to the music room, which had been transformed by the hour and the lighting into a space so different from its daytime character that Clara felt as though she were entering an entirely unfamiliar room. Candles burned in silver holders placed on the pianoforte and on tables throughout the space, their flames casting shifting shadows that softened the formal elegance of the furnishings and created an atmosphere of intimacy that made Clara acutely aware of the irregularity of this arrangement, and the fire burned brightly in the hearth, driving back the December cold that pressed against the tall windows where frost had begun to form intricate patterns on the glass. Alexander stood near the fire and turned when she entered, and she was struck immediately by how different he appeared, more relaxed than she had ever seen him, with his formal coat discarded and his collar loosened slightly, as though he had deliberately shed some portion of the ducal armor he wore during daylight hours. He welcomed her with a warmth that seemed to encompass genuine relief at her arrival, as though he had harbored some fear she might change her mind, and he gestured toward the pianoforte, while Mrs. Langley settled into a chair positioned discreetly near the fire, where the housekeeper arranged her knitting with the air of one prepared for a long vigil. Clara removed her evening shawl, a worn garment of dark blue wool that had been her mother's, and arranged her music on the stand, with hands that trembled slightly from nerves and cold, and something she could not quite name. And when she sat on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys, she felt Alexander move to stand where he could watch her face as she played. She began with a nocturne by Field, the gentle melody seeming appropriate for the late hour and the quiet intimacy of the setting. And as she played, she felt the nervousness begin to ease, as it always did when she lost herself in music, the notes flowing from memory and feeling rather than conscious thought. When the piece ended, Alexander did not immediately speak, but moved to sit in the chair positioned near the pianoforte, where he could see her clearly, and he asked her to play whatever she wished, saying that he was content simply to listen and to have the companionship of another wakeful soul during these hours when sleep eluded him. She played 2 more pieces, quiet, contemplative works that seemed suited to the midnight hour. And between selections they began to talk in voices kept low by mutual unspoken agreement, as though unwilling to disturb the particular quality of peace that had settled over the room. He asked about her father, and she found herself speaking more freely than she had intended, describing the man who had loved music with a passion that bordered on obsession and who had taught her not merely technique, but the language of emotion that could be expressed through melody and harmony. And she admitted that her father's death 6 years prior had left her feeling as though she had lost not only her parent, but her connection to the part of herself that felt most alive. Alexander listened with an attention that felt complete and genuine, and when she finished speaking, he began to tell her about his late wife, Catherine, in a way that suggested he had not spoken of her in this manner to anyone since her death, describing not the idealized memory that widowers often constructed, but the real woman with her kindness and her limitations, and he confessed that his grief had been complicated by guilt that their marriage had been comfortable but never passionate, arranged by their families and accepted by both parties as suitable rather than chosen from any deeper connection. The conversation created a sense of shared vulnerability that felt more intimate than anything Clara had experienced, and when she looked toward Mrs. Langley, she saw that the housekeeper had dozed off in her chair by the fire, her knitting fallen into her lap, and her head tipped forward in sleep. Clara felt she should wake her, or perhaps suggest ending the evening, but Alexander asked her to play 1 more piece and mentioned that his father had been an amateur musician who had often played in this very room during Alexander's childhood, and Clara selected a composition her own father had written years ago, a bittersweet melody that seemed to capture something essential about memory and loss. She played with her eyes closed, feeling the music completely, and when she finished and opened her eyes, she found Alexander had moved closer and was regarding her with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat because it held unmistakable tenderness and something deeper that she dared not name. The clock in the hallway struck 2, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell had been woven between them. And Alexander rose and thanked her with a sincerity that conveyed far more than gratitude for a service rendered, and Clara gathered her things with hands that shook not from cold, but from the awareness that something had shifted irrevocably between them during these midnight hours, and as Mrs. Langley stirred and woke and rose to escort her out, Clara looked back once to find Alexander still standing by the pianoforte, watching her departure with an expression she would carry with her into sleep and beyond. December 17th, 1817, midnight. The second midnight performance felt both familiar and charged with new possibility, as though the ritual they had established the previous week had already become something essential to both of them, and when Clara arrived at the side entrance to find Mrs. Langley waiting with a candle to light their way through the darkened house, she felt her heart quicken with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the music she would play. The music room glowed with candlelight as before, but tonight snow fell heavily beyond the tall windows, visible in swirling patterns whenever the wind gusted against the glass, and the fire burned even more brightly than it had the previous week, as though in defiance of the winter storm that wrapped the house in white silence. Alexander stood near the pianoforte rather than by the fire, and when Clara entered, he turned to her with an expression of such unconcealed pleasure at her arrival that she felt warmth rise in her cheeks and had to look away to maintain her composure. Mrs. Langley settled into her accustomed chair with her knitting, but Clara noticed that the housekeeper seemed less vigilant tonight, her attention drifting to the fire and her needles moving with mechanical rhythm that suggested her thoughts were elsewhere. Clara removed her evening shawl and seated herself at the pianoforte, and she began to play a Chopin nocturne that seemed suited to the snowy night. But after only 2 pieces, Alexander asked if they might simply talk for a while, saying that he found her conversation as restorative as her music. She agreed with a mixture of nervousness and pleasure, and he drew a chair close to the pianoforte, near enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. He began to speak of loneliness, not the physical solitude of being alone, but the deeper isolation of occupying a position that set him apart from genuine human connection. And he described how the title of Duke had created a barrier between himself and authentic relationship, how people approached him with deference or calculation, but rarely with simple honesty. Clara listened with complete attention, recognizing in his words an echo of her own experience of invisibility, though her isolation came from being beneath notice rather than elevated above it, and she said as much, explaining that she understood perfectly the hunger for someone to see past surface circumstances to the person within. Their conversation created an intimacy that felt almost dangerous in its intensity, and when Alexander rose to turn the pages of the music as she began to play again, he stood close beside the bench, near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence and catch the faint scent of sandalwood that clung to his clothing. She made a small error in the passage she was playing, her concentration broken by his nearness, and he noticed but said nothing, simply remained standing there, as though he too was reluctant to move away. When the piece concluded and silence fell between them, Alexander asked with a gentleness that took the sting from the question why she had never married. And Clara felt her throat tighten with the familiar shame of that particular failure. She considered deflecting or offering some polite evasion, but the honesty of his own revelations seemed to demand equal honesty from her, and so she admitted with painful directness that no one had ever asked, that her modest circumstances and her lack of conventional beauty had rendered her invisible to potential suitors, and that she had long ago accepted that marriage was not to be part of her life story. The words hung in the air between them, and she could not bring herself to look at his face, afraid she would see pity there. But Alexander was silent for a long moment, before speaking in a voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him over the crackling of the fire, and he said that invisibility was always a failure of the observer rather than the observed, that those who had overlooked her had revealed only their own blindness, and not any deficiency in her, and the words carried such conviction that Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. She looked up at him then, and found him regarding her with an expression that held no pity at all, but something far more unsettling, and the moment stretched between them waited with unspoken meaning until Mrs. Langley stirred in her chair and coughed softly, and the spell broke. December 24th, 1817, Christmas Eve, midnight. Clara arrived at the side entrance of Pembroke House, carrying with her a nervousness that had nothing to do with the snowstorm that had begun earlier in the evening, and now wrapped the estate in swirling white silence. And when Mrs. Langley admitted her with a particularly warm smile and a whispered wish for a blessed Christmas, Clara felt her heart beating so rapidly she feared it might be visible beneath the fabric of her modest grey dress. The music room glowed with what seemed like twice the usual number of candles, their flames casting a golden warmth that transformed the familiar space into something almost magical. and the fire roared in the hearth as though Alexander had ordered it built up especially high against the bitter cold that pressed against the frost-covered windows. Alexander stood near the pianoforte rather than his usual position by the fire, and when Clara entered, he turned to her with an expression of such unguarded happiness that she felt her breath catch, and before she could remove her evening shawl or greet him properly, he crossed to her and pressed a wrapped parcel into her hands, his fingers brushing hers in a contact that sent warmth racing up her arms. She stared at the package in confusion and growing distress because she had brought nothing for him, had not imagined that gifts would be exchanged between a duke and his employee. And when she tried to refuse, he insisted with a gentleness that made refusal impossible. And so, with trembling fingers, she unwrapped the brown paper to reveal sheet music. Rare compositions by Mozart that she recognized immediately as pieces her father had loved and spoken of but never owned because of their scarcity and expense. The thoughtfulness of the gift, the clear evidence that Alexander had listened to her casual mentions of her father's preferences and had taken the trouble to acquire something so specifically meaningful, overwhelmed her completely, and she felt tears gathering in her eyes as she thanked him in a voice that shook despite her efforts at composure. She apologized for having nothing to offer in return, but he dismissed her concern and asked only that she play for him. And so she seated herself at the pianoforte with Mrs. Langley settling as usual into her chair by the fire, and Clara began to play not one of the new pieces he had given her, but a composition she had written during the past week, a melody that began in the minor key of melancholy that characterized her earlier work, but gradually shifted into major tonality, building toward a conclusion that felt hopeful and almost joyful in a way she had not allowed herself to express through music in years. She played with complete absorption, pouring into the piece everything she dared not say aloud, and when the final notes faded into silence, she kept her hands on the keys and her eyes closed because she was afraid to see his reaction, afraid she had revealed too much. But then she heard his footsteps approaching and felt him standing close beside the bench, and when she finally opened her eyes and looked up at him, she saw in his face an expression of such tenderness that her careful defenses crumbled completely. He reached down and took her hand in his touch warm and sure, and he began to speak in a low voice clearly intended only for her ears, saying her given name for the first time, saying Clara rather than Miss Thornhill. And he told her that these midnight hours had become the center of his days, that her presence had awakened something in him he had thought died with his wife, that she had brought music and light and life back into rooms that had been silent too long. He was beginning to say something more, something that sounded like the preface to a declaration, when the door to the music room suddenly burst open and Sophia rushed in wearing her nightdress and wrapper, her face flushed with excitement and apology in equal measure as she explained that she could not possibly sleep with Christmas morning so close, and had heard the music, and simply had to come see them. The moment shattered like glass, and Alexander stepped back from the pianoforte with visible frustration, while Clara pulled her hand from his and rose from the bench. And Sophia seemed to realize belatedly that she had interrupted something significant because her excited chatter faltered, and she looked between them with dawning comprehension. Clara gathered her new sheet music and her shawl with hands that shook, and made her excuses about the late hour and the need to return to her lodgings. And Alexander tried to delay her departure, but she could not bear to remain in the room with Sophia watching, and whatever he had been about to say now impossible to complete, and so she fled with Mrs. Langley following, and carried with her into the snowy night a confusion of hope and fear that kept her awake long after she reached her modest room. December 31st, 1817, New Year's Eve, evening, 7 p.m. Clara arrived at Pemberton House with her heart still carrying the confused hope that had haunted her through the week since Christmas Eve, wondering constantly what Alexander had been about to say before Sophia's interruption, replaying the warmth in his eyes and the tenderness in his voice as he had spoken her name and taken her hand. And though she had not seen him privately since that night, because he had been called away to attend to estate business in the north, she had received a brief note in his hand asking her to attend this evening's gathering to finalize musical arrangements for Sophia's debut ball in 3 weeks. The drawing-room glowed with candles and a cheerful fire, and Sophia and Caroline greeted her with genuine warmth. But Clara immediately sensed a tension in the atmosphere that made her uneasy, and she understood the source of that tension when she saw Lady Beatrice Somerset seated in the place of honor near the fire, surrounded by 3 other society matrons whose names Clara did not know, but whose expressions of cool assessment she recognized all too well. Alexander had not yet arrived, detained by a meeting with his steward, and Clara felt exposed without his presence as she took the seat Sophia indicated near the pianoforte, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible while the ladies discussed arrangements for the ball with an attention to social hierarchy that made every comment feel weighted with judgment. Lady Beatrice held court with her usual authority, describing the guest list and the necessity of maintaining proper standards, and then her gaze fell upon Clara with an expression of exaggerated surprise. And she said in a voice clearly intended to carry across the entire room that she was astonished to find the music instructor present at what she had understood to be a planning gathering for family and intimate friends. Sophia began to explain that Miss Thornhill was advising on the musical program, but Lady Beatrice cut her off with a laugh that held no humor and announced that it was one thing to employ a person to teach scales and quite another to include such a person in one's social gatherings. And she turned to the other matrons with a conspiratorial expression and added that she supposed standards had relaxed considerably since the late Duchess's time. Clara felt her face burn with humiliation, but kept her expression carefully neutral, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the pianoforte, willing herself to endure this with dignity. One of the other ladies joined Lady Beatrice's attack, observing with false sympathy that it must be dreadfully difficult to be a woman of 28 with no family and no prospects, and another added with a meaning glance that some women seemed to have ideas above their station, and Clara understood with sick certainty that gossip about Alexander's attention to her had already begun to circulate among the society matrons who guarded their world with such vigilance. Lady Beatrice delivered what was clearly intended as the killing blow, saying with elaborate concern that she hoped dear Sophia would not be tainted by associations with a piano instructor of— and here she paused delicately, such unremarkable appearance and advancing years. And the other ladies tittered behind their fans, while Sophia's face flushed with anger and Caroline looked near tears. Clara rose from her chair with as much composure as she could summon, intending to excuse herself and spare the sisters further awkwardness. But at that moment the drawing-room door opened and Alexander entered, and his gaze went immediately to Clara's face, and then swept the room, taking in the hostile atmosphere and the satisfied expressions of the society matrons, and his own expression hardened into something cold and dangerous that Clara had never seen before. December 31st, 1817, New Year's Eve. Evening, 7:15 p.m. Alexander stood in the doorway of the drawing-room with an expression that made Lady Beatrice's satisfied smile falter, and he moved into the room with deliberate slowness, his gaze fixed on the society matron with an intensity that silenced the nervous titters behind fans and caused even Sophia to hold her breath. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried such authority that Clara felt the words like a physical force even as she stood frozen near the pianoforte with humiliation still burning in her cheeks. He addressed Lady Beatrice directly, saying that he must have misheard her comments because surely she could not have intended to insult a guest in his home, a woman of extraordinary talent and impeccable character whom he held in the highest personal regard, and the emphasis he placed on the word personal sent a ripple of shocked understanding through the assembled ladies, who suddenly sat straighter in their chairs and exchanged wide-eyed glance. Lady Beatrice attempted to recover by laughing and saying she had meant no offence, but merely observed what everyone surely thought about the peculiarity of including a music instructor in family gatherings. But Alexander cut her off with a coldness that made Clara understand why men respected and feared him in business, and he stated that Miss Thornhill was not merely a music instructor, but a gifted composer and performer whose presence enriched his household immeasurably, and he added with devastating precision that he valued her company and conversation far more than that of certain society figures whose only accomplishment seemed to be the skilled deployment of malice disguised as concern. The other matrons looked as though they wished to sink through the floor, and Lady Beatrice's face flushed an ugly red as she began to sputter a response. But Alexander continued speaking, now addressing the room at large, and saying that his late wife had possessed the wisdom to value people based on their character rather than their bank accounts or their appearance. And he had strayed from that principle during his grief, but Miss Thornhill had reminded him what truly mattered, and any person who could not recognize her worth was revealing a profound deficiency in their own judgment. Clara stood trembling with a confusion of emotions, because while his defense filled her with gratitude and something dangerously close to joy, it also made their connection terribly public, and would certainly fuel exactly the sort of gossip that could destroy what remained of her reputation. And she saw in the faces of the society matrons that they were already calculating how to spread this delicious scandal through every drawing-room in London. Sophia looked torn between triumph at seeing Lady Beatrice humiliated and worry about what this public defence meant for her brother, while Caroline openly grinned with delight at the discomfort of the women who had been cruel to someone she loved. Alexander then turned to Clara and asked in a gentler voice if she would do him the honour of playing something, anything she chose, because he wished very much to hear her, and he thought the room could benefit from the elevation that only true artistry could provide. And though his words were a request, his eyes held a plea that she understand. He was offering her a choice about how to proceed in this moment that had suddenly become pivotal for both of them. December 31st, 1817, New Year's Eve, evening, 7:30 p.m. Clara stood before the pianoforte with her heart beating so hard she wondered if everyone in the drawing-room could hear it, and she looked at Alexander and saw in his eyes both a plea and a promise, and she understood in that moment that he was offering her a choice that would define the rest of her life, because if she played now, after his public defense of her, it would be an acknowledgement of the connection between them and would cement in the minds of every society matron present that something significant existed between the Duke and his music instructor. She could refuse politely and retreat to the safety of invisibility, could preserve what remained of her reputation by declining this invitation that was so much more than a request for music, or she could step forward into the candlelight and claim the recognition he was offering her, even knowing that society would judge her harshly for presuming to accept attention from a man so far above her station. Lady Beatrice had recovered some of her composure, and now sat with her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, clearly hoping that Clara would have the decency to recognize her place and refuse, while the other matrons watched with avid curiosity barely concealed behind their fans, already composing in their minds the gossip they would spread through every drawing-room in London about the aging piano instructor who had somehow entrapped a grieving duke. Sophia looked at Clara with encouraging warmth and gave her a small nod as if to say that she had her blessing and support, while Caroline clasped her hands together with barely suppressed excitement at the unfolding drama, and Mrs. Langley stood near the doorway with an expression of calm approval that gave Clara an unexpected surge of courage, because the housekeeper who had seen so much of life in this household would not look at her that way if she thought Clara was making a terrible mistake. Clara moved to the pianoforte with as much grace as she could summon and sat down upon the bench, arranging her modest skirts with deliberate care, and she placed her hands upon the keys and closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself and thinking of her father, who had taught her that music was truth, and that the honest expression of feeling through artistry was the highest form of courage. She began to play the piece she had composed for Alexander on Christmas Eve, the hopeful melody that represented everything she had been afraid to want, and she poured into it all the longing and fear and cautious joy that she had carried through these past weeks of midnight performances and deepening conversations, and as her fingers moved across the keys, she felt the last of her protective reserve fall away because she was choosing to be seen and choosing to step into the possibility he was offering, even if it meant risking everything. The music filled the drawing room with its bittersweet beauty, and she did not look at Alexander as she played, but she felt his gaze upon her like a physical warmth, and when she finished and the last notes faded into silence, there was a moment when no one moved or spoke, and the tension in the room was almost unbearable before Alexander began to applaud with slow, deliberate appreciation. And then Sophia and Caroline joined him enthusiastically, while the society matrons sat frozen in their seats, clearly uncertain whether acknowledging Clara's performance would be tantamount to approving the scandalous connection they all now suspected. December 31st, 1817, New Year's Eve, evening, 7:45 p.m. Alexander stood beside the pianoforte as the last echoes of applause faded and Clara remained seated with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes downcast, and he realized that despite his public defense and her courageous acceptance of his invitation to play, she still believed herself unworthy of the regard he wished to offer her, and the knowledge filled him with a fierce determination to make her understand not only in words, but in actions that would leave no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Lady Beatrice rose abruptly from her chair with a rustle of expensive silk and announced in a voice edged with barely controlled anger that she had developed a sudden headache and must take her leave. And the other society matrons quickly followed her example with hurried excuses that fooled no one because they all recognized the humiliation of the evening and wished to escape before witnessing whatever shocking development might occur next, and within moments the drawing-room had emptied of everyone except Alexander and his sisters and Mrs. Langley, who remained stationed near the doorway with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Sophia approached Clara at the pianoforte and took her hands and said with earnest warmth that the performance had been absolutely beautiful, and she hoped Miss Thornhill understood how much she and Caroline valued her, not just as an instructor, but as a dear friend. And Caroline chimed in with characteristic enthusiasm, saying that Lady Beatrice was a horrible creature, and everyone knew it, and she was glad her brother had finally told her exactly what she deserved to hear. Clara looked between the two sisters with eyes that had begun to glisten with unshed tears, and thanked them in a voice that trembled slightly. And Alexander watched this exchange with his heart full, because his sisters had always possessed better judgment than half of society combined, and their wholehearted acceptance of Clara only confirmed what he already knew about her character. Mrs. Langley cleared her throat gently and suggested that perhaps the young ladies might help her ensure the departing guests found their cloaks and carriages, and Sophia caught the housekeeper's meaning immediately and took Caroline's arm despite her younger sister's protests, and within moments Alexander and Clara were alone in the candle-lit drawing-room, with the fire crackling softly in the hearth and the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them like a held breath. Clara rose from the pianoforte bench and turned to face him and began to apologize for causing such disruption to his household and his sister's social prospects. But he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and took both her hands in his, and said her name with such feeling that she stopped speaking and simply looked at him with an expression that mingled hope and terror in equal measure. He told her that she had apologized quite enough for circumstances that required no apology, that she had done nothing wrong by being exactly who she was, and what he needed to say to her could not wait another moment because he had already been interrupted once on Christmas Eve, and he would not allow propriety or fear or the judgment of small-minded people to prevent him from speaking now. Clara stood very still with her hands clasped in his, and he could feel her trembling slightly, and he realized that despite all the midnight conversations and shared music and moments of connection, she still could not quite believe that he truly saw her and valued her and wanted her in his life permanently. He said that over the past months she had brought light back into a household that had been dark with grief, that her music had reminded him that beauty still existed in the world, and more than that, her kindness and intelligence and quiet strength had reminded him what it meant to truly admire another person, not for their title or wealth or social position, but for the content of their character, and he had fallen in love with her so gradually and so completely that he could no longer imagine his future without her in it. December 31st, 1817, New Year's Eve. Evening, 8 p.m. Clara felt the words wash over her like a wave that had been gathering force across an ocean of loneliness and finally crashed upon the shore of her defended heart, and she stood in the candlelit drawing-room with her hands still clasped in Alexander's and tried to comprehend what he was saying to her, because surely she must be misunderstanding or imagining or dreaming, except that his grip was warm and real, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt about his sincerity. Even if her mind could not quite accept the impossible truth that a duke was declaring love for a penniless piano instructor who possessed neither beauty nor fortune, nor any of the qualities that men of his station were supposed to value. He said he had fallen in love with her gradually and completely, and could not imagine his future without her, and the words hung in the air between them heavy with meaning and promise, and the weight of everything that would change if she allowed herself to believe them. And she felt tears begin to slip down her cheeks unchecked, because no one had ever spoken to her this way, and no one had ever looked at her as if she were precious and irreplaceable, and she had spent so many years accepting her invisibility as natural and right that she hardly knew how to exist in a world where someone truly saw her. Alexander released one of her hands to gently touch her face and wipe away her tears with his thumb, and the tenderness of the gesture broke something open inside her chest that had been locked and frozen since her father's death, and she found herself saying his name not as a title, but simply as Alexander, in a voice that trembled with emotion she could no longer contain. He asked if she understood what he was offering her, and if she could possibly feel even a fraction of what he felt for her. And she wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question, because she had been half in love with him since the first midnight performance, when he had listened to her playing with such profound attention, and had spoken to her as if her thoughts and feelings mattered, and she had fallen completely during all those late-night conversations, when he had revealed himself to be not just a duke, but a man who carried loneliness and grief and hope just as she did. She told him yes, that she understood, and that she had been afraid to hope, but that her heart had refused to listen to her sensible mind's warnings about the impossibility of such an attachment, and he smiled then with such joy that it transformed his usually serious face into something radiant. He said there was one more thing he needed to ask her, and that he hoped she would not think him too precipitous or improper, and he released her hands and reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, and Clara's breath caught in her throat because surely he could not mean what the gesture suggested. December 31st, 1817, New Year's Eve. Evening, 8:15 p.m. Alexander opened the small velvet box with steady hands, despite the enormity of what he was about to ask, and inside gleamed a ring of simple elegance, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the candlelight and threw tiny stars across Clara's stunned face. And he said that this had belonged to his grandmother, who had been a woman of remarkable character and intelligence, much like Clara herself, and he had chosen it specifically because his grandmother had always told him that true partnership in marriage was built not on fortune or title, but on mutual respect and genuine affection and shared values. He lowered himself to one knee before her in the traditional posture of supplication, and Clara felt the room tilt around her because this could not possibly be happening. A duke kneeling before a penniless piano instructor in a gesture that acknowledged her as his equal and even elevated her above him in this moment. And he said her full name, Clara Thornhill, with such reverence that it sounded like a prayer. He asked if she would do him the extraordinary honor of becoming his wife, of sharing his life and his home and his heart, of being a mother to his sisters until they married and eventually to whatever children they might be blessed with together. And he said he knew society would disapprove and gossip and judge. But he had learned over these past months that society's opinion mattered far less than the truth of one's own heart, and his heart had chosen her completely and irrevocably. Clara looked down at him through tears that blurred the candlelight into golden halos, and she thought of all the years she had spent invisible and dismissed, all the times she had accepted that marriage and love were not meant for women like her, all the quiet resignation she had wrapped around herself like armor against disappointment. And here was this man, this impossible, wonderful man, offering her not just security or even affection, but true partnership and recognition of her worth. And she realized that accepting him would require more courage than resigning herself to solitude ever had, because hope was so much more frightening than despair. She said yes in a voice that broke on the single syllable, and then she said it again more clearly. Yes, she would marry him. And Alexander rose and slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made for her. And then he cupped her face in both his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her feel precious and cherished, and finally seen. The door burst open, and Sophia and Caroline rushed in, followed by a beaming Mrs. Langley, and it became clear that they had all been listening outside and could contain themselves no longer. And the sisters embraced Clara and welcomed her as their soon-to-be sister with such genuine joy that Clara's tears flowed faster, and even Mrs. Langley dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Alexander kept his hand at the small of Clara's back as if afraid she might disappear, and he announced that they would be married as soon as the banns could be read, and Sophia declared that it would be the most romantic wedding London had ever seen, and Caroline said Lady Beatrice would absolutely perish from shock and jealousy, and they all laughed together in the candlelit drawing-room, while outside the bells of London began to ring in the new year of 1818, a year that would bring Clara everything she had stopped allowing herself to dream of, and as Alexander pulled her close and whispered that he loved her, she finally believed that she deserved this happiness, that her worth had always existed even when no one else could see it, and that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began not with grand gestures, but with quiet midnight conversations and the courage to hope when hope seemed foolish.